think we are live. Okay, yes, we are live. All right, Rob Tiffany, thank you for taking the time to have the conversation. I hope people can take something from this. I hope people, enjoy our conversation, and I hope, yeah, you enjoy it equally as much as the people listening take something from it. So yeah, once again, just wanted to say thank you for coming and thank you for joining this talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Before we start and I ask you the first question, I kind
Yeah,
of want to basically talk about how we met in the first place and highlight the good in social media. So
right.
basically in 2013, I believe it was, is when I did my placement year in university. And I started in a place called South Staffordshire PLC. It's a water company. And at the time, a manager called Jamie Logan gave me a book actually called, don't know if you can see it.
Oh my God.
That's exactly. For those who's listening, SQL Server Compact Edition database development with the .NET Compact framework. This was actually
Wow.
one of the first books I read to understand programming, and I particularly loved the story, and I was really inspired from how you created it and why you created it, and then going on explaining in such a way that I can follow. And so, yeah, he's somebody that obviously I looked up to and still do actually. We still talk and we still meet up to this day a lot, who's, invested time in me. And yeah, from that book, I think our company actually built a lot of their PDA systems because that's our flagship, was the flagship device at the time, using PDA systems, going to different places with test engineers, looking at asbestos in different places. But anyway, yeah, I go on to say all of this just to say thanks. I thought, you know what, let me go on LinkedIn. You never know what happens. You might reject it, accept it. And then obviously, you know the answer because we're here today. You accepted gracefully. And obviously, we've kept in touch since, talked about, all sorts of things happening in technology from like mobile enterprise, SQL, NoSQL to now IoT. So I say all of this to say to people listening, you just never know when you reach out to somebody. The worst they can do is say nothing, or the worst you can do is do nothing. Because if you don't do nothing, nothing will certainly happen. If they say
True.
no, at least you can move on and try again, because you just never know. So I just highlight all of that story just to say, yep, you never know. With the power of social media, you can do a lot. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's great stuff, man. That is such a blast from the past, that book.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Just
speaking about blast from the past, maybe you can talk a bit about your history for those who don't know who you are. Maybe
yeah,
talk about time in the Marines, maybe talk about the Microsoft days, the IoT
sure.
stuff. Yeah, why don't you give us an intro?
Lots of adventures out there. Yeah. Yeah, let's see. Going back in time. Yeah, but you know what? Gosh, you said the Marines. So going, if I go way, way back, I used to drive submarines in the Navy, in the U.S. Navy. Uh, who would have thought that you would find time to teach yourself how to write code while you're on a submarine? That's exactly what I did. So this is a lifetime ago. I was on two different submarines. Really cool experiences. It's not for everyone. Not everybody wants to be in a tube underwater. But I was on a special ops submarine, a SEAL team delivery vehicle. I don't know if anybody, you have to be really old, but if you remember the Gulf War a long time ago, the first time we were hanging out down in Iraq or whatever. Anyway, believe it or not, there was underwater stuff going on and deploying SEALs and stuff like that. And I have to say, it's great working with those guys. They're actually the nicest guys you ever meet until they like flip a switch and go into combat mode.
Yeah, totally different
uh,
person.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But and then after that was over, decommissioned that submarine, and that's kind of how I moved to, you know, so much of my career has been in startups and at Microsoft, up here in the Seattle and Redmond area in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. And literally, that's how I arrived here. I'm originally from Texas, but when we had to decommission our SEAL team submarine because it was really old, we decommissioned all the nuclear subs in this shipyard that's up here in the Northwest in a town called Bremerton. And so I literally arrived in the Seattle area like by popping up a hatch and saying I'm here, which is a strange way to arrive in a new place. Um,
Oh, yeah.
so a little different. Then after that, transferred to there's another submarine base up the road. I don't know if you've actually I know you have them in the UK, Trident
Okay.
submarines. Yeah, so I was on one of our Trident submarines, the Alaska, um, which is a totally different thing. Not nearly as exciting as hanging out with the SEALs and doing mini subs and crazy James Bond type stuff. This was a little more boring. You're just kind of cruising around. It's kind of terrifying though. You're waiting for the message from the president to blow up the planet. So that's kind of weird. um, but you know what? I spent a lot of time, so much, and you probably lived this too. So much of how you're going to make yourself who you are, and that actualization of what am I going to be? What am I going to do? So many people wait for other people to hand it to them or give them, oh, you need to send me to a special training class, or you need to do that. And for me, it was always buying books, to be honest with you. And so I remember being underway on the submarine, and I bought these books early days. So you're thinking back in the 90s, and so I'm learning about databases like Access, and things
I
like that,
remember.
and
Yeah.
and then SQL Server, and learning about Visual Basic, which was popular in those early days back then in the 90s, and so yeah, just teaching myself so that when I got out of the Navy, um, I had a place to go. I mean, my college degree was in political science. Um, so how did I end up being a developer? And it was basically, I probably have a whole library, a million books, it feels like, at home, stacked up over the years of just, teaching yourself different programming languages, basics, and after a while, once you learn one language or a couple, you kind of notice there's commonality across lots of them. A lot of things are the same. And so, because we have all these trends in software development and patterns, and new languages get hot, and and you have to keep evolving, right?
Yeah, of
So
course, definitely.
yeah, so did that, and then when I got out of the Navy, I stayed in the Seattle area and ended up taking a job with a startup, um, which really probably ended up having a bigger impact on the rest of my life than I imagined I would. Today you and I talk a lot about the Internet of Things and doing these IoT projects, and being a part of those, building these systems. Back then in the 90s, I was started with this company called Real Time Data, and they were literally connecting vending machines, um, and finding out, getting telemetry, and finding out what their inventory was, you know, um, and when I put it in perspective, I think how hard it was to do that back then. You had these fully mechanical vending machines selling candy, Cokes, whatever. Um, there was no high tech computerization of these machines. There was no wireless connectivity, whatever. And so imagine, as a young guy, learning from all these old guys. Some of these guys were radio frequency, RF engineers. Some of the guys who actually created the whole black box that you see on every airline on the planet, were a part of this startup. And so you can imagine having teams that were doing. Part of them were, we had to build our own modems. It was the
Okay.
early days of cellular,
Wow.
primitive
Dial-up.
network. Yeah.
Wow.
We had to build our own firmware, and that we put into vending machines and wire it in, and building our own software on PCs, back then. And so it was really hard to pull it off. But in the end, we were able to find out, what's the current inventory in vending machines. Does a guy have to go drive around mindlessly and visit every vending machine? And you can apply this to all kinds of businesses, as you can imagine, with supply chain or things like that. Instead of having to visit every machine, now we can tell them, hey, you only need to go here and here, and here's exactly the products that you need to refill, because this telemetry data that we got from the machines telling us, hey, these products, these are the only ones that are out of stock that you need to refill, that kind of thing. So, you can imagine early on, we thought the value, and there wasn't a name like IoT back then in the 90s. Um, and we were, again, it was like primitive cellular networks, and we would sometimes have to cobble together our own networking. And again, like I said, we had to create our own modems sometimes. Um, But over time, you know how sometimes you have an intent to do one thing and you stumble upon something else that you hadn't planned on. Um, One of the things we stumbled upon was finding out that we had real-time insight in the buying behaviors of the customers of these vending machines. And so we could see their preferences. And so, you know, normally you'd see like a bank, a bunch of vending machines all together in different buildings, offices, whatever. Um, and over time, instead of just using this technology to save money, which is very similar to IoT today, a lot of people are trying to use IoT to save money with predictive maintenance and things like that. But with that real-time insight, we found out what people really liked and what they wanted, and we could determine in real time, you know, people were buying more of a particular product that, you know, maybe they're buying lots of Snickers or M&Ms or whatever. And so in real time, we we're like, okay, let's double up or put double or triple the amount of those in the machine, and then we could find out the products they're not selling as well and take those out. And so we were able to help our customers using this primitive form of IoT to save money and make money in the early days. And I guess what's good, a good lesson from that, at least for me now, is IoT is such a big mega trend and so hot, and everybody thinks it's magical. Comparatively to back what we had to do then, it really just all seems really easy to me. Um, it's almost like you're in the Matrix at the end of the movie and Neo can start seeing the ones and zeros. It's like, yeah, this is no big deal.
Wow, that's interesting, actually. So we're kind of talking about why IoT is important and the benefits of IoT. I kind of want to take a step back and maybe for those listening who aren't familiar with IoT, maybe you can explain what actually is IoT.
Yeah, sure. You know, if you think back to the rise of the internet, when that came online, and then the web, you know, Tim Berners-Lee created the web in the early 90s. And so the first version, you know, the internet of, it's kind of the internet of content, really. You had just plain web pages back in the 90s that were almost like a brochure or something. Here's what's going on with our company or our product. And then you started to have dynamic web stuff, and you started seeing e-commerce like Amazon and things like that start to come about. And so, and then the rise of social media in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. And so you went from internet of content, just looking at stuff, to kind of the internet of people, where you had blogging, you had Facebook, you had all kinds of social media, lots of things that came before Facebook that maybe didn't make it. Um, and so you had this internet of people interacting, communicating, and so that whole rise of social media. And then this latest thing, this Internet of Things, is basically how do we give a voice to inanimate objects, to machines, to sensors that are all around us, to find out valuable information about what's going on with them. And so I think you know, like I said, we did that kind of stuff in the 90s, so it's not like we had to wait, but it was much harder back then. It was really expensive to retrofit old machines and find out information about them. Because, you know, normally, and I say this a lot about the Internet of Things around IoT, a lot of the times a person has to physically go somewhere and inspect and look at and find out what's going on with this machine. Like, I'm going to go look at the vending machine and see what's in stock, or I'm going to go jump over the fence into your backyard and look at the meter and see how much electricity you're using, and I'm going to write it down on a piece of paper and take it back to the office. So much of that world of humans going somewhere to inspect something, to find out, I need to find out what the state of this thing is, what's the temperature, what's the pressure on this, in this, you know, hydraulic system, you know, whatever it happens to be. You know, I need to go find out what's going out in the fields of my farm. What's the soil moisture, what's the temperature like. And so IoT allows us to kind of just have that remotely know what it is instantaneously. And so a lot of that is, you know, it's connectivity. And I'd say more so kind of the rise of kind of more and more ubiquitous wireless connectivity, which has really made a lot of this possible. It made it possible for us in the early days in the 90s, and it certainly makes it possible today. And so having wireless and then being able to, I think there's been a perfect storm of sensor whatever it is, an accelerometer, a temperature sensor, humidity, whatever it happens to be, the price of those has dropped dramatically in the last several years. The price of, what we would call a microcontroller, and, for people watching, just think of this as a really tiny, tiny computer, with compute, like CPU, storage, networking. The cost of those has come down dramatically. The cost of sensors has come down. You've got wireless almost everywhere, and all kinds of wireless. You might do things differently indoors than you might do outdoors. A connected car might use cellular, but inside a building you might use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or whatever. Um, and so all those things came down. And I think the last piece, well, you've seen the rise of the cloud, and as the cloud got popular, you saw the other part. If I'm collecting all this data from all these things, storage used to be expensive and limited, but today it's not that way anymore. The cost of storage seems like it's just going to zero, at least in the cloud. It's super cheap. So you can store lots of data. And then I think the last component I would say is, it kind of makes the democratization of all this possible, is the analytics technologies. And so whereas in the past, only the wealthiest companies or governments could afford these high-end analytic tools that cost millions of dollars, today I can just go to apache.org and download Spark or all kinds of things. Now I still have to know how to use them, but they're free. And so if I put all those pieces together, I can now remotely know what's going on with remote things, machines, devices, whatever, out and about. And then I can apply either simple or really advanced analytics or machine learning, to find out insights. And those insights, can have value. It can make me more money as a business. It can save me money, it can provide better customer experience. Or it can be used for even bigger, more important societal things. Uh, you know, am I doing early detection of a forest fire before things get out of control in Australia or something like that, or water issues, stuff like that. So I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm kind of rambling here.
No, yeah, no, that was great. Actually, I was going to pick up on something you said. You talked about the use of wirelessness and different technologies, sensors, and things like that. So, is it fair to say it's related to socket programming? Obviously, you've got IPv, well, 6 now, previously it was 4.
Yeah,
Sort of technologies are what is used to actually create these IoT, like Internet of Things, essentially.
yeah, no, that's a good point. So you can imagine, if we go back in time and think about our time, like with that book you held up, where we were doing really tiny programming, embedded programming, either on embedded devices or mobile devices. So software that's much smaller than what you might see on a laptop, and then efficient protocols. How am I going to use software to send packets of data from that thing? So you and I learned how to build this stuff on smartphones in the early days when you didn't have a lot of memory. Well, and how to send data efficiently for smartphones to derive value for those folks. Whether I'm, instead of a thing telling me what its state is, I'm still doing inspection, and maybe I'm capturing data on my Windows mobile phone, a decade ago. Those same things that you and I learned provided the foundation to teach us how to be great IoT developers. Because if you're a server desktop developer, you're used to having a lot more memory and storage and things like that, and CPU power, and so you can maybe get away with things. Whereas if you're trained as an embedded developer or a phone developer, where you don't have a lot of memory, you get a kind of a level of discipline to build much more efficient software, and that's what's needed in IoT. And so on these little things, these microcontrollers, or it could be, things that people understand, like single board computers. Everybody knows about the Raspberry Pi. People know about Arduino, and there's lots of other little devices like that. And then there's industrial versions of things like that. Um, Again, there's not a lot of RAM. There's very little storage. It's a really slow CPU. And there's a reason for that, because it doesn't use very much battery power. It's really efficient. And so being able to write small embedded software, whether it's, you pick your language, a long time ago, the only way you were doing embedded software was C or C++. And then over the years, thanks to, I guess, Moore's law, right?
Yeah.
You can use higher and higher level languages on those devices than you could before. And so now today, like on a Raspberry Pi, I can, that thing's getting pretty powerful, actually. I can see people using Node.js, JavaScript, I can see them doing C#. I've seen Java on it, all kinds of
So yeah,
Python.
maybe 10 years ago you could have said this is a good example of something very limited, but the Raspberry Pi is actually really impressive. It was impressive back
Yeah,
then. It's really impressive right now as well, all the things you can do on it.
absolutely. The other part of the efficiency, besides your software being small, tight code, fast code that uses fewer CPU cycles and less RAM, is also how do I choose to send that data over the wire or wireless? And so, over the years, we've had all these kind of different data formats. XML used to be popular a long time ago. It's an easy way to communicate with different devices and they could all understand each other. But it's kind of big and bloated a little bit and not as efficient. We kind of learned that in the mobile days. Um, you saw the rise of JSON as a format, which came right out of JavaScript, and it was an easy way to convert an object and serialize an object and send it over the wire. And so you see JSON being used a lot on IoT devices because like you might map, like if a device has several sensors on it, a machine, maybe temperature, humidity, whatever, things like that, you can map those sensors as properties in a, and use JSON in a JSON object. And then all the programming languages make it easy to serialize, convert that JSON object into a string that you can send over the wire. And then, of course, you can be even more efficient. You can use binary protocols to make it even tinier, um, except the other end has to understand what's going on with the binary because that's sometimes a little more opaque, right? You don't know
Yeah,
what's going on there. Yeah.
that's true. It's actually interesting because actually I didn't realize this until a few years ago. My final year project in university was an IoT project, but I don't know if IoT was as popular, a few years ago when I was creating it. So I actually did have like a Raspberry Pi and I had a few sensors and I sent packets of data using socket programming and it was IPv4 at the time, where you
Yeah,
send packets of data wirelessly to the Raspberry Pi or to the wireless sensor on the Raspberry Pi. And I got it to play music based
that's
on
great.
voting on, I had a desktop application, all this stuff. And actually looking back, it wasn't until actually we had one conversation about IoT and just actually thinking what IoT is. It's like, oh, actually, I did do that a few years ago. It's just different.
You
Actually,
realize that now you were an early pioneer of
I would
IoT.
go that far. I think, yeah,
So yeah,
give you
you
that
were
much. Yeah.
absolutely. It's
Okay. If
yeah,
you say
you're
it, then I'll take it.
you're doing your socket programming. And it's interesting you bring up that kind. There's the language, there's the format, but then you're right. How do I make that connection? And so in your case, you were using sockets. There's a lot of ways you see people today doing IoT. There's the idea some of these devices just send little bits of data and go back to sleep again. And so, like if I look at the most popular ways today that you see, REST is still number one. So
Yeah.
just HTTP, just posting or doing GET requests, just like building RESTful APIs. That's still the most popular. It doesn't mean it's the best, but it's the most pervasive, and everybody understands it. And so, because it's just kind of web based. Um, in a close second place is something MQTT, which is more of a full connection based type scenario, kind of like when you talk about sockets. Not as efficient as sockets, but it has the idea that it's trying to always be connected, and it follows this methodology called publish subscribe, where maybe I have a million devices scattered around London and they're all publishing their data to a server, an IoT server in the cloud or wherever. Um, and then you might have subscribers who could be analytic systems or it could be people with smartphones or whatever, that could say, hey, I want to subscribe to that data that's coming in from that one temperature sensor, over along the Thames or something like that. And so that whole model, and then the ability to then, the other part of IoT besides just getting telemetry is something called command and control, where I want to send a command to an actuator to that machine to tell it to do something. Like I need a hydraulic pump to start going faster or whatever, or I need to slow down a motor. Maybe I'm getting telemetry data from a motor, an electric motor that's maybe rotating at 10,000 RPM. And I'm at the same time, I know its speed and I know its temperature, and the temperature, I'm just using simple kind of KPIs that say, hey, it's going in the red, it's getting too hot, the motor's going to fail. And so I can do, a simple example of IoT is using that temperature and the RPM. I can then have my logic on my server side or whatever, put those two together and say, okay, I'm going to send a command back to the machine to say, slow down to maybe 7,000 RPM or 5,000 RPM so that it slows down. You need to chill it out so that it doesn't overheat. And so MQTT is good at doing that because it's more fully connected to send those commands. If I was doing HTTP, just REST, I would probably have to pull over and over again to find out, hey, do you have anything new for me? Hey, do you have anything new for me? Unless, of course, you use WebSockets, which is part of the W3C, for the spec for the web for HTML5. And WebSockets is a great option. And it's a widely used standard. And so WebSockets, you could kind of do the same kind of thing you were doing with real sockets, right? Back in the day. Other people use all kinds of other things. There's AMQP, which started on Wall Street for doing financial transactions. It's kind of like MQTT, not exactly. In the telecom area, like when I work at Ericsson and mobile operators and others, so there's this notion of if I'm either using HTTP, like full TCP, which has a lot of overhead to make sure the packet gets there successfully and all that.
It's not UDP.
Yeah, and then there's UDP where it's fire and forget, and so it's super efficient. In fact, UDP is used a lot for streaming video and audio, where because it's so much more efficient. And so other protocols, one's called CoAP, that goes over UDP. It looks like REST, but it's kind of shaved down and it's more efficient because there's none of the retries or any overhead of TCP. And then there's protocols built on top of CoAP, that mobile operators are looking at to efficiently do stuff like that. Anyway, there's a million of them.
Yes, there is. And we touched on it a little bit before. You were talking about the usefulness of IoT. And I've noticed recently you've become more and more active in like climate change and changing the conversation that way. Maybe you want to talk about how IoT can make a difference and if you are doing anything actively in that space
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. So if I think over the long haul, doing what I did in the 90s and then at Microsoft, I was involved in we had an IoT platform. It was a kind of a SaaS-based offering called Connected Intelligent System Service, actually is what it was called. And then that actually never launched. It was in preview for a long time. And then with the rise of Azure, moved over there and we had event hubs, then we built IoT Hub, and then you kind of have the full-blown Azure IoT. And so again, you're working in there, you're seeing the business uses of it. I went to Hitachi and built, I got to create this industrial IoT platform called Lumada, which was a great experience for me to do the whole thing myself end to end, have it come out of my brain and
Wow.
design it, which was crazy.
Pretty something, actually, yeah.
Yeah, getting to design, write the specs, create a prototype, hiring engineers, PMs, and we built this industrial IoT platform that's more focused on, manufacturing, riding on bullet trains, all kinds of stuff. A lot of good experiences there, and was not always cloud-based. It had to be portable. It could have to run everywhere. And over time, you learn a lot, and while you're usually thinking about all this stuff for business and the value for business, pretty soon you realize that there's a lot of value for the broader society. And so to your point around climate change and sustainability, you start to realize that gosh, there's I hear all these anecdotal use cases. I always think the use cases are the most important thing. Over time, I know it sounds, I don't know, kind of arrogant. I don't know, but the technology ends up being the easiest part of the whole thing. And discovering the important use cases, and in this case, having an impact on society. Like for instance, I remember there's a water pump company in Denmark called Grundfos. And I remember their CEO saying that depending on the infrastructure of your city, how mature it is, or maybe it's really old and out of date, uh, those cities are losing anywhere between 9 and 60% of their fresh water to leakage every day. And which sounded crazy to me, because here we are, we're facing more and more water issues all around the world, and then you find out that our own cities are just leaking all the water away, which is now one of the most precious commodities, right?
Yeah.
And so you immediately put the dots together, and that's an easy one you can imagine. It's like, well, gosh, I need to be monitoring all these pipes and pumps, whether it's underneath. There's a whole hidden infrastructure that no one even sees underneath their city and in the skyscrapers and all the buildings, moving water around, and it's all just leaking out depending on how good it is. So whether you're measuring water leakage and finding out where it's happening so you can fix that, um, part of that sounds like just common sense and making sure you're providing a good service for your citizens of your city. But on the other part, all this stuff is critical as water becomes more precious, and can't be taken for granted, right? um, you know
Definitely.
yeah, and so doing that everywhere. Talking about, obviously everybody's been talking about all these fires in Australia lately. um, if you can imagine, while I can't stop a fire with IoT right now, um, if I think of IoT just as early warning, just like you have a smoke alarm in your house, that tells you it detects smoke, and it sounds the alarm for you to get the hell out of your house, or your apartment or your flat or whatever. And so you can imagine, with a low cost of sensors that are really battery efficient. Maybe it can run on one of those little coin batteries, or maybe it has solar power attached. You could imagine where we could deploy, sensors throughout forests, around the world, or at least start in places that are more susceptible to fire, that are just measuring things like temperature and humidity, and maybe smoke, uh, to give us early warning that, hey, the conditions are right for a fire, or a fire is happening. And you know how it is, if you catch something early, maybe you can put it out quickly, before it spreads too far. I
Yeah.
remember spending time in national parks and realizing that so often when you're walking around a national park, in whatever country, you're just out in the middle of nowhere. And I remember imagining, if something happened to you, or if you noticed something, hey, I'm noticing the beginnings of a fire, or I'm seeing flooding happening, or maybe a wild animal's about to attack me. I was imagining, wouldn't it be nice to have a Raspberry Pi with just a big red button on it that I could push, that would send a message to the forest ranger or somebody to come help me, or give them an early warning about something. And so I think it's whether we're using sensors in these places, or
Mhm.
allowing people who see something to be able to say something, do something really simple.
Yeah. And even with IoT, there might not even need to be a button or anything. There can just be a sensor
Yeah,
where, motion detectors, using that for animal, or what, like if there's an animal somewhere near, or, approaching a human being, that can trigger something. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot that IoT can do. And
absolutely.
hopefully IoT, obviously with climate change and other things, it can really make a difference, which is why I'm happy to see IoT just skyrocket. Everyone's talking about IoT. Everyone is kind of looking and seeing what can IoT do. And obviously
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
pioneers that have been leading that, like yourself, and hopefully all the initiatives that you are doing, holds weight, and definitely there's some success into that. So we can
What it
actually.
sounds like to me is when you talk about what you're doing, when you talk about what I'm reading, when I'm on your website reading what you're writing about people, everybody's got a skill, you know, are they using that skill for how they live their life or their job or whatever, or are they doing something different than their skill is? In my mind, me contributing stuff and building systems for free to give away for nonprofits or non-governmental organizations or whatever to help this is basically just saying I have a skill, I know how to build these systems, and now it's not about the money, it's about helping society. And so that's something I want to do, and as you know, everybody has a talent. um, and so part of this, depending on where you live, not everybody is you know is feeling like it's all hands on deck with this climate issue. But I'm a big fan of science. so so it's not unusual to me. It's like, just listen to the scientists, and even if you don't believe that humans are causing this, you can still observe that things are a whole lot hotter, and bad stuff's happening all over the world. And so what are we going to do about it?
Mhm. Yes, regardless of the science, whatnot, like people can see visibly that things are happening that it doesn't seem right or isn't right, and we
Yeah.
can use IoT regardless of the reason. Some people might not believe in climate change, so we can actually just part that aside and look, this isn't right. Let's use IoT. Let's you leverage technology to actually make a difference in this space. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. Bring your talent, whatever your talent is,
yeah.
bring it to the table and help us.
Yes, you don't have to be an IoT guru. You can be somebody that's just willing and able to just want to make a difference. That can just be making it known, advertising it to people, that sort of thing. There's different
Yeah.
levels. We're talking
Yeah.
about of IoT, but behind IoT, there's people behind the creators.
Absolutely. So I started this thing on the side, kind of like you talk about having a side hustle, your side gig. I started this thing called the Moab Foundation. Um, and I apologize, people in the UK have no idea what Moab is, but it's a town in Utah, in America, where I always highly encourage, if you like going to national parks or seeing crazy beautiful things, there's some great national parks in Arizona and Utah where it's not just beautiful mountains with snow. It looks like you're on Mars, and seeing these giant arches and crazy canyons and weird formations. And so I love going to do stuff like that. And so when I was building this IoT technology, more of a kind of and we can talk about it, you hear a lot of people talking about the edge. It's more of a lightweight, edge-based IoT technology uh, to be used for sustainability. And so I was kind of inspired by that being out there. So I just called it Moab.
Oh,
Was the name of the system, just because that's the name of this town where these parks are all around it. Anyway, it was important for me to not only build technology to help us with sustainability, but it was also important to make sure the product, the technology itself, was sustainable. Because I could build some big giant mega server cloud-based thing to do that, uh, and I'm eating tons of electricity that might be getting created by coal plants for all I know. And so it was important to, back to you and I having embedded programming skills, was even when you're building something that looks like it belongs on a server, build it using that embedded thinking to make it efficient. And so, I built something that's kind of server based, but I could run it on a tiny little, whether it's a Raspberry Pi or if it's an x86, something like a low power Atom processor or something with very little RAM. Using embedded, instead of maybe a big giant database, I might be using something like SQLite, an open source embedded database that runs everywhere. Because if I want to help people, the other part of this equation is always is money.
mm,
People, you want to help them, but you can't show up and say, "Hey, I'm going to help you with this technology, and I need you to pay me all this money to get it." I'm going to give away the software, but there's always hardware and other things that cost money. And so I'm always thinking, how do I build something that can be on the most low end, efficient stuff you can buy, so it could be really cheap for people, or you can be donated or things like that. And so that's kind of always in the back of my head. So, use your embedded mobile skills to build efficient servers that look like they're embedded servers. I'm not even saying that right.
So it's basically think mobile first in a way, and
Yeah.
then from there just expand it onto web applications or bigger applications which have normally more data, more RAM, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely makes sense because obviously when you have something limited, you often have to be more creative with that. So that's
Yes.
the byproduct of being a mobile developer because you've got limited resources. You've got to think outside the box sometimes, then how to leverage your creative skills in somewhere that you need to use it for data to an
You're
enterprise.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And so yeah, I want to build something that if my one little unit, little small thing, it's running on a small little hockey puck looking thing, and it draws very little power, and someone could run that in a farmhouse, and they've connected all their field or their crops or their orchards, getting telemetry about the health of their. Think about this when we think about sustainability, and that's why I also like kind of going after there's the United Nations has their 17 sustainable development goals.
Oh
uh,
yes,
and so what's helpful about that is it's a great way to just kind of, it gives you a nice list of things to go after. And so what I try to do, and I've got a lot of work to do, is for all the different sustainable goals, some are about water, some are about poverty, they're about food, they're about climate, sustainable smart cities, things like that. um, it's a great way to sit back and think of all the use cases where IoT could apply and be used in those different categories. And so if you think about food, we have to feed we're going to have to feed more and more people with less. We're like lots of things in life, right? I have to do more with less, right?
yeah,
uh, and so using IoT technology to do like people talk about precision farming. um, and so if I can put sensors that are telling me what the temperature is and soil moisture and things like that, solar radiation, putting cameras or using drones to look at the leaves to see if some kind of disease is happening, all kinds of stuff like that. uh, you know Farmers are going to have to get more high tech, to build to deliver more food with less. They don't have any more land, and they're going to have to fight. We're using nature to help us, but you also will find yourself fighting nature because we have more erratic, you know, levels of rain, or we have drought, or we have disease that goes through crops and stuff like that. And so we really need to equip farmers all over the world but we also have to know that they don't have a lot of money to go do that. Farming kind of can be pretty tough, right? And so I'm always thinking, it's like, how can I help farmers? How can I'm always thinking it's got to be easy and understandable to use. It needs to be power efficient, and it needs to be just low cost or free, to
yeah.
get those folks going.
I agree, and it definitely shows from the books I've read of yours, like that understanding factor is very important. Keeping it simple but effective so people can actually look at, your books that you're teaching people how to, do mobile embedded systems, how to grow into the IoT space. And with that, actually, that kind of leads on to one of my final questions is, as VP, Global Head of IT in Ericsson, do you have a strategy for people who are just beginning in this IoT space or are considering IoT, where to start? Do you have a good starting point in terms of books and gadgets? What would you say for those who want to really get involved into the IoT space?
Oh, that's a good question. God, there's no shortage of books, are there? I wish I had my list off the top of my head. There's been some great writers who've put stuff out. There's lots of good blogs too. Um, some of these, an easy way to see some information, we started our conversation just talking about connecting on LinkedIn. There's some good IoT groups on LinkedIn where people are publishing articles. Another thing I like to do is, do you know how I can Google? You can go into Google and give it some keywords and tell you to send you an email whenever it finds news or something about those words each day. And so what I do is I tell Google looking for IoT and Internet of Things and climate change and stuff like that. And so I get an email every day from Google telling me all of what's the news of the day, what are people talking about, what just happened, in whatever those categories. Obviously, people can use this stuff for anything, and so getting that, you kind of get a daily digest, summary of what's going on around the world in IoT or climate change and what people are saying. It's a great way to see different use cases that people are tackling.
And
Uh,
do you have, by the way, do you have, I think you do, I might be mistaken, do you actually have tutorials about IoT yourself?
I have some on my blog. They can just go to robtiffany.com. I've got some tutorials on there. Probably not as many recently as I've had in the past. A lot of times I'll just talk about high level things. I did create a series of videos that I put on YouTube. I think there might be maybe 70 of them. I was calling them the IoT Minute. After a while, some of them got a little bit longer than a minute. Um,
It's the
but
classic, right?
yeah, exactly. And to be honest with you, the reason I started off calling it IoT Minute was I wanted to make sure that I wanted to have a bite-sized bit of information. Like maybe I'm going to talk about MQTT today, and I'm going to tell you everything you needed to know in 60 seconds. Part of it was I wanted to give bite-sized information to people that they could learn every day. The other part was actually to make sure it could fit on Instagram videos back then. That was the big thing, actually,
Ah,
back when they had that limitation.
oh, yeah. It always starts off like that. It's classic tech. You're limited, and then all of a sudden you get a growth. Happened with data, happens with everything with technology.
Yeah, yeah. And so I've got like 70 videos, on YouTube, where I talk about all kinds of IoT scenarios and go deep, in all the different subject areas, right? Whether it's the thing, the device itself, how to program it, sensors, connectivity, edge gateways, edge development, the whole server thing, security, digital twins. Digital twins have been a big passion of mine. That's where I spent most of my time when I was at Hitachi building Lumada. Uh, we actually called them something different. We called them asset avatars, which sounded kind of cool, like some kind of giant alien. But it fit in manufacturing. People call in manufacturing everything is an asset. And so I'm really passionate about the power of digital twins being used in IoT to digitally model things in the real world, whether it's a car or a subsystem of like an engine of a car, or how they all work together, a fleet of cars or an assembly line, how industrial robots all interoperate with each other. Um, that's interesting space to keep watching, is this digital twin space. It's also a great way to do analytics against that. You see the current state of whatever it is, maybe it's your car, and everything about it, and then you can apply KPIs and analytics to all those things, and they can all trigger automatically. It's a little different view. A lot of people think of data kind of streaming in and they're building analytics and it's triggering stuff and finding out information. Digital twins, you might just have data flow in and kind of, if you think like programming, hydrate an object that looks like a digital version of your car. Doesn't mean it has to be like one of those 3D CAD models of your car, because that can get pretty crazy. But it could just be, a digital representation, properties, things like that, just like you think of in object-oriented programming. Um, that's a great space, and I've talked a lot about that in my videos.
Okay, and I know you do have one or two books about IoT. Specifically, I think the one I know is the one with Windows 10 and the Raspberry Pi. I think you've got a book.
Yeah, I wrote some articles on those. Yeah,
Okay, articles.
I
Okay,
did.
is that
Yeah,
on your website?
that's on my website. Yeah, it's on robtiffany.com. So yeah, I talked about, how to talk to, like, you're right, a Windows 10 IoT core uh, OS running on a Raspberry Pi, how to pull all the sensor data together and transport that to Azure IoT Hub, and then ingest that data, and what to do next with it. So yeah, I wrote a bunch of articles for that. Also with the Qualcomm made it also kind of a micro, like a single board computer. I think it was one of their kind of Snapdragon devices. Um, yeah, so back when I was when I was on the Azure IoT team, and so writing a bunch of stuff, to teach developers how to do that stuff. And as you can imagine, so as I'm building technology for this Moab product, which is kind of similar, on the moabfoundation.org site, there is a developer reference. Even though most of the site's talking about sustainable development goals and trying to build out the use cases to help society, there's a developer reference there that I'm slowly building out, and so you can see all the REST APIs, and how to use the system, how to communicate with it, you know, add things to it, users, groups, access control, nerd stuff like that.
Awesome. And what can we look for? I know you've hinted you've got a website as well. You've got blogs on there. Do you obviously you've got a novel coming up as well? I think it's called The Battle of Seattle. You've got online courses. So yeah, tell me some of the stuff we can look forward to.
Okay. So yes, I do write a lot of books, and I've tried to branch out in the past to break into writing novels instead of just technology or business books. And so, yeah, several years ago, I wrote a book called Submarine Warriors, which was kind of a, adventure. It's for kids, kind of, I'd say, the same age group of kids that like read Harry Potter and those kind of books.
Right.
uh yeah, so I wrote a book called Submarine Warriors about these kids in this adventure, and and yeah, using stuff I learned from being on a submarine and making that real, kind of like Hunt for Red October for kids. um and so did that, and that was a lot of fun, and it was so different, and it was great to go to different schools, and read to kids, and have them be involved in that. And so I've been working on the sequel. I've been really lazy because it's taken too long. But I think the bad creatures in this first book were called the Underworlders, and they live under the sea, and they've got all these powers and stuff. And so there's a lot of kind of sci-fi fantasy kind of woven in. And so this next book is kind of, the working title is, the Underworlders Strike Back. And so you can imagine this book is them coming back hard against our heroes, these kids. And yes, there is a chapter called The Battle Seattle, and it's pretty ugly.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah, that should be coming out soon. I'm really trying hard to finish it, juggling stuff. A few years ago, I wrote another more high level business book, just called Mobile Strategies for Business. And I have something similar I'm working on for IoT,
Oh,
which, kind of like the videos I did. Instead of it just being some long, big, giant book about it, I'm trying to make it just a little bite size. Each page or two will talk about these different topics. And so expect that book to be, it'll kind of cover all the stuff you need to know around IoT from end to end in bite sized pieces, and then it'll spend a lot of time on the use cases. Here are the important use cases for business and for society and sustainability and things like that. So working on that too. There's not enough hours in the day.
there never is. There never is. Um,
Absolutely.
what else I was going to mention? Yes. Do you often come to the UK? I know you work for Ericsson, which is, as you said, Swedish company?
Yeah, they're in Stockholm.
Okay. Do you have any appearances? Do you often come to the UK?
You know, I think I was in London a couple of times this last year.
Hmm.
So yes, yeah, I think I can see that happening.
Okay, awesome. And
For sure.
um, you're really big on the IoT market. Is there anything IoT related in the UK that you know of that, if people are interested to Google, they can see when it is and stuff like that? Is there any big IoT conferences that you're aware of?
I get, people ping on me a lot about conferences that are coming up. I think there's a version like the same IoT World Conference that happens in Santa Clara or San Jose. I think there's a UK version of that. Um, it's not in the UK, but close by is a conference coming up in June called IoT Week, and it's going to be in Dublin,
Ah,
just
okay.
across the water from you. Um, and you know what? I went to IoT Week this last summer. It was in a small town called Aarhus in Denmark, and really inspiring. I've been to a lot of IoT conferences, maybe like a lot of other people, and after a while, it's same stuff, technology. What was really cool about IoT Week was it was more of a purpose. It turned out the whole event was all about sustainability, kind of the stuff we're talking about. So every keynote address, every breakout session, all the panel discussions, the hackathons, every one of them was tied to one or more of the sustainable development goals. And so I thought that was really cool because it gave purpose to IoT rather than just kind of being a bunch of techie nerds talking about stuff. It was how to make an impact. And so, and it made an impact on me for sure. And so that same event is going to be in Dublin. So I'll probably be at that for sure.
Awesome. Sounds good. And my last question relating to the Marines is, how did you being in the Marines give you the mindset or the mind state to be where you're at now, become a developer? Was there any tools from being in the Marines that helped you become who you are today?
You know, um, Obviously, you always have hopefully some kind of internal passion. Um, you know, when I was in the Navy and doing submarines, it, a couple of things, aside from your job and what you're doing, obviously, it gave me time to, I don't want to call it time out from the rest of the world, but it gave me time to really think about what I really wanted to do in the future. Um, and, you know, I certainly learned that I had a passion for writing, for writing code too, and building these systems, and thought that was enjoyable. You know, Another thing that I would say that it's helped me dramatically is your perspective on life. So lots of people these days are really stressed out at work, and they are overwhelmed by what they have to do at work and the decisions they have to make. Sometimes it just feels like it's too hard or it's the end of the world or something like that. And I see this all the time everywhere. Um, I think what helped me being on these submarines and being a combat veteran was it all seems pretty easy to me. Like the stuff that people are freaking out about in business just doesn't seem like it's not, it's, you're not going to die.
Fair enough.
um,
It's relative.
yeah, it's all relative. And so it's like, well, we used to do some pretty crazy stuff with the SEALs or missiles and stuff like that. And a lot of things could have gone wrong. And, and so when you become acclimated to that level of seriousness, of stress, of major impact on the whole world, and then that becomes normal for you, when you go into business situations or other things, uh, it helps you to not be overwhelmed and think that the mountain in front of you is too high to climb. You're just like, I got this. And so, yeah, it kind of gives me a calmness maybe about things, like, yeah, we can figure it out. And also risk taking, your ability to go for things, to take bigger risks, I'm not going to die if this doesn't work out. Because you know what? The most success I've had in my life and my career was from taking big risks. Uh, Playing it safe feels to most people like the right thing to do, the safe thing to do. Uh, but it also may lead to a life of just too much normalcy or maybe mediocrity or whatever, and less excitement and maybe less, fulfillment in what you're doing. I know it's easy for me to say, hey, take risks, and a lot of people are afraid to do that. But at least in my experience, every time I took a big risk and went for something and stuck my neck out, that's when really cool stuff started to happen. The other thing I would say too, in life and success is kind of like what you're doing now. Start writing, just start writing and putting yourself out there. Write articles, write blog posts, write on LinkedIn, on Twitter, everywhere you can write little books. It's easier than ever to be a published author. You can just write stuff for free and put it on the Kindle on Amazon. Start writing stuff. And a lot of times people are afraid to express their maybe strong opinions because they're going to get flamed and beat up by all the other people who are going to read it, and that will happen. But I think what I've noticed is the more you write about it, really solidifies kind of who you are, and I think it's helped me dramatically. I think just in life and my career and just writing, because writing has such a great reach and long term. It lasts. And so, and then when I started writing training stuff to teach other people how to do stuff. And then the next thing I knew, I was writing articles in Java development magazines. And then I started writing books. And then, and then you start speaking because you were writing. And then pretty soon you're keynote speakers at different events. And so things snowball. And then I think that expressing yourself and putting that pen to paper and getting it out there and taking the arrows that people are going to shoot at you and keep going, I think is one of the most critical things you can do to be successful in your life and your career.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. So for those people obviously listening who are thinking of going into IoT, thinking it's a risk, I'd say go for it. And those people who are thinking, what if, I think just go for it. You never know. Like
Yeah.
I reached out to you like 7 years ago. You just never know.
Yeah.
And so it's funny actually, because I'll take it back to when I was talking about my manager. And we always joke because he read your book and helped. He's been in the company that I went to. He's still there now, since like for at least 20 years, I think. And he helped build that system. If he actually took his knowledge from that book and did something else, he always jokes saying that I'd be sipping tequilas on a yacht just because he would have made his own business. And he always looks back on that and thinks, what if? So it's
Yeah.
always something I always tell people, like if you have a passion for something and you're just thinking, especially being young, because a lot of the things I do is with students and whatnot, this is the right time to be reckless and this is the right time to take risks because you just
Yeah.
never know if you're going to get that chance again. So obviously echoing what you've said, I couldn't agree anymore. I'm glad you said that. So just for people that are, listening and watching this, they can also take that in from someone who's done it. Has been in the
Sure.
Marines, has helped pioneer the IoT market that it is today. And, it's really important that people can hear that from you yourself.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. No, it's my pleasure.
And
What,
and it's good, like you said, talking to students, it's good to be a teacher.
yeah,
uh, take what you learn and give it back and teach other people. A lot of people try to hoard their knowledge because they think they need to make sure they're more important, or whatever secret knowledge they have, they need to keep it so that they're more valuable. I found that the opposite is true. The more you give away, the more valuable you become, and it's better for everybody. You always hear terms like uh, leaders are readers, like reading lots of books. I also think leaders are teachers. I think to be a great leader, you really need to be a teacher. Uh, and of course, it's also when you need to learn a subject, if someone tells you you're going to have to teach it to someone else, you'll learn that subject at a much deeper level.
it's true. It helps your understanding, and then you can help teach because you're learning still and you're teaching others based on your learning. So it's always about
Absolutely.
growth in that sense as well. And you're always hungry to learn more. And I think that's also a key as well. You're just always driven to do stuff. I
Right.
think it'll take you a long way. Exactly. No, I totally agree. I couldn't agree anymore. I'm just glad you've said it so people listening are hearing and taking that in as well. Where can people find you, by the way, if they want to just reach out?
Yeah, yeah. So well, let's see. On Twitter, it's just at Rob Tiffany. You know, LinkedIn, I'm all over that place. Where else? Gosh, you know, you know, I fly all over the place doing my stuff with Ericsson, bringing connectivity all over the world. Um, you know, I'm always speaking at different events. Is it if anybody's going to be at Mobile World Congress coming up at the end of February in Barcelona? I'll definitely be there. Happy to meet up with you there. Probably be at IoT Week in Dublin in the beginning of June, and lots of other events. And yeah, you know, definitely reach out. I probably need to get to UK so we can just hang out for a while.
Sounds good to me. Better to leave it off there then. I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Thanks again for taking the time. I know this was interesting for me, and I hope other people found it interesting as well. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
No, honestly, it's my pleasure, and it's a long time coming, and I'm just glad we just, we got it there now.
This is a SkillStruct presentation. If you like what you hear and see, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.